So our object today, I guess, is to give Kerry and Mel a chance, or anybody, to ask anything that they want to ask, have any conversations that they would like to have, I think.
Um, was the sorry, just as part of the debriefing, were the sessions going to be coded in a certain way, in the sense that they'd be like, oh, this percent was visual, this percent was auditory, et cetera, or is that separate?
So, and by as part of the debriefing, you mean today?
Yeah, or just whenever.
So I think what we've talked about in that regard is that we do have what we call a green meeting, and a green meeting is where we review all the samples, and that is not, at least in my head, what we're doing today. Today is a debriefing meeting where everybody gets a chance to make sure that they understand what we did and whatever. And we agreed that sooner or later we would have a green meeting, and in that green meeting we would rate things probably, and so we would be able to say such and such a percentage of visual stuff, but that would not be the overall goal. The main goal of that would be, the main goal of the green meeting is to make sure as best we can that we're on the same page as far as the phenomena are, and to refine our understanding of the phenomena. So it could be that I would see it one way and you would see it somewhere else, somehow else.
Mhm.
And in talking about it, we would come to a new understanding of how these things emerged.
Cool.
And usually there's some counting involved because people want us to count, but it's categorization and counting is not the primary aim. I don't think I did anything to cause that.
Um, okay, well, Mel, do you have any questions to start with?
Well, I feel like it makes more sense for you to start, given we just did, like, you were the study of this experiment. So I feel like that's a natural way to start if you want to kick us off.
Cool. One of the first questions I wrote down, and this was sort of related to the TV segment that Julian sent around, the German TV. But I wrote, if we're not the best judge of our own inner experience, how do we know that any of this is accurate?
Well, I would say that's the fundamental question of all introspection research. And the answer to that is, the first answer is I think we don't actually know for sure, but then I think we would do the best we can, which is to say, well, in my recollection of Kerry's samples, she had quite a few what we've called inner seeings, where she described seeing a yurt or seeing a refrigerator or seeing whatever. And I think if we went back and counted all those things, which I have actually done, I shouldn't say I've counted, but I have gone back through all the samples to spend 15 or 20 minutes today preparing to be able to answer any questions that you might have. And so I think you had you reported quite a few inner seeings. And that was quite different from Mel, who didn't report hardly any, if I'm recalling correctly, inner seeings. And so the question, sort of the fundamental question is, well, is Kerry's inner experience different from Mel's, or do they just use different words to describe the same experience? Their experience is the same, but Kerry says it's visual imagery, and Mel says it's something else. And so the question becomes, should we believe that Kerry's inner experience consisted of a lot of visual imagery? Is that really true? So I think that's what your question is. Should we believe that? And the answer is, well, it comes down to Kerry. So Kerry, do you, at the moment of the beep where we talked about things like yurt cabins and refrigerators or whatever, what's the possibility that at the moment of those beeps you were not seeing a yurt cabin or not seeing a refrigerator?
In my opinion, no possibility, but yeah.
So I think that's the best we can do. So I think what we have done is we have defined a moment as best as possible that we can define a moment. That the beeper is the best that we can do. If somebody had a better idea, we would be using it. And we have trained Kerry adequately, I think, in terms of paying attention to what's going on with the experience. And she says, believably enough, there was visual imagery there. And I think we understand what we're talking about. We have refined our language. So we've done everything that we can do to ensure that we know what we're talking about. And Kerry seems quite confident that it was that she was seeing a refrigerator at that beep and seeing a cabin yurt at that other beep, and so I find those reports entirely believable. But there are people, there are philosophers who would say, well, nobody has any inner experience. The only time you have any inner experience is when you're stopped to think about it. And so at the moment of the beep, Kerry had, at the moment of the yurt beep, for example, Kerry didn't have any experience of the yurt, but when she knew she had to tell us about it, well, then she made up a yurt right then on the spot, and she did it so fast that she convinced herself that this was actually ongoing before the beep was concerned. And I don't think we can talk ourselves. I don't think we can disprove that. I think that's possible. I don't think it's very likely, but I think it's possible. But even if that's the case, if you buy that's the case, then you have to answer the question: well, why is it that Kerry would, at the moments of her beep, create in this instantaneous thing, create visual imagery, whereas Mel would not? Kerry and Mel seem quite different in that regard, regardless of whether you see it as ongoing or made up on the spot.
Okay, so in relation to that, one of the questions that I had, or was just curious for your take on, Russ, and this is very much storytelling, contextualizing things, but obviously I think Kerry and I are a nice combo because clearly our experiences, the way we report them, are very, very different and in some ways sort of polar opposites. So in line with what you're sort of saying there, one of my questions is to do with what we do for work, and I wonder whether you have found anything like this in your other examples of DES, in terms of, obviously I am a documentarian, I tell people stories, and so much of how I know you hate the word process, but process the world is feelings-based, and there's no visuals in my head and all that stuff that we've discussed. A lot of how I see and think and process is feelings-based, and I think that allows me to be very good at what I do for my job, because I don't have anything getting in the way of someone else's story. I take it in, I feel it, and I tell it. In a similar sort of way, Kerry works in graphic design, visuals, language like that, and so she has this hyper-visual brain often. She processes things in a very visual way, and that to me is oh yeah, so of course you'd be a really great graphic designer, and of course I'd be good at what I do because I speak through feelings. So for me, there's so many questions there about chicken and egg, and whether you have also found interesting comparisons between how people interpret people's inner experience and what they do for work, etc.
So I take that as what I would call a personality question. So the question is there some personality characteristic, what you do for work or whatever, lumping that into personality, and some correlation between that and inner experience? And I'm guessing the answer to that is yes, but it's not. But I don't know the answer to it for sure. The personality studies require a lot of people. You're into the hundreds of people randomly selected from all over, and we just don't have anywhere near enough data to answer those questions. My recollection of your samples, Mel, is, and I didn't review yours just before today. I probably should have, I guess. But my recollection of your samples is that they weren't feelings based. They were more nothings based, or more
Yeah, I was thinking about this today, actually, how I never used this. I used to say vibes. It would be a nothingness, and then there's a vibe, a concept, or whatever. You know, I know if I'm thinking something, you know, there was a lot of autopilot, there was a lot of nothing. But if I was thinking of something, it was not audio, not visual, it was just a vibe is a word I used. But I think today I was thinking like a word I would probably use is like intuition. Like I would say my inner experience, I like that word to describe a lot of my inner experience when it's not that nothingness.
And I think that's fair. I think intuition is a pretty good word to describe the way I recall your experience as being. If by intuition we mean, well, I was obviously paying attention to the world. I wasn't thinking about it in any particular thematic way, but I was obviously skillfully moving through the world, and you could call that intuition. I think that's a perfectly good way. So what I really think about the answer to your question is I don't think it's necessarily the case that Kerry's visual imagery makes her a good graphic designer, or your intuition makes you a good visual storyteller, or whatever.
Whatever you do for work.
Whatever you do for work, right? So what I think is that the way your experience is colors the way you do for work, and Kerry's inner experience colors the way she does for work. And I think it would be possible for Mel to, if Mel's history had been such by accident that she ended up in the graphics design world, she probably could have done graphics design. And if Kerry's history had been such that she ended up with video, whatever, she might have been able to do video stuff. And but she would have done it her way, and you would do it yours. Which is not to say one's better or worse. All that said, I think we don't know the answer to that question. There is no doubt some reason that Kerry stumbled into graphics design and Mel stumbled into video production, or whatever we're going to call that. And that, I think, has something to do with your inner experiences. But it has a lot to do with a lot of other stuff too, probably.
I had a fairly similar question, but rather than asking that same question over again, a tangential version of it is, in the new year, I'm actually getting tested for ADHD because this experience has helped me realize how distracted I am, like, all the time. And I was wondering, and comparing, obviously, to Mel, is it even possible for someone who is so present and intuition-based to have something like ADHD? Like, does that correlate in any way, or is that just like an outlandish storyline to say?
So
You don't want to.
ADHD is a melting pot diagnosis. I think there's a lot of probably very different people who get called ADHD, and that's not to disparage the diagnosis of ADHD. It's because we could say that about a lot of other things, but I guess the theme of probably what I'm going to say about a lot of this stuff is that we don't have enough information about what actually goes on in inner experience in ADHD. I haven't studied ADHD. People haven't studied ADHD and the experience in ADHD in a way that I would find adequate. I would say, first off, I didn't find your experiences to be that you were distracted. It did not occur to me at this speed. Well, Kerry's distracted here, and Kerry's distracted there, and Kerry's distracted at the other. That was not my reaction to that. And if you're comparing your inner experience to Mel's and concluding on the basis of that, well, I had a lot of visual imagery where Mel was just sort of present to what was going on in the world around her. Therefore, I must be distractible.
Yeah.
I'm thinking that's not a fair comparison to make, because Mel is more unusual than you are. Mm-hmm. I think Mel's lack of specific inner experiences was pretty unusual, whereas Kerry's particular kinds of visualizations were not particularly unusual. A lot of people have a lot of visualization. So I'm not trying to diagnose your ADHD or lack thereof. I'm just saying don't go there because you think your experience is different from Mel.
No, that's not. There's a lot of other reasons why I've come to this. It's been a long journey, but this has been, like, I guess part of it. I've just been more reflective about how my thoughts work, and it's been a contributing factor to wanting to get tested. But I just thought it was an interesting. I don't want to make any, like, grandiose claims or anything, but just in the I guess in a similar vein to how you studied bulimia and, like, plurality of thought, I was wondering if there was any sort of correlation with ADHD. And
not that I know of, but I don't know. I think it would be a very interesting population to study. Well,
I agree.
With the exception that I think it is sort of a melting pot
kind
of a deal. So there's a lot of different kinds of people. So.
Yeah.
But then, so sort of in a similar vein, like, Kerry, I probably had the same existential crisis that you're having after this. I had the opposite, obviously, of, like, wow, am I like a bit of a freak and sort of, like, overly numb to the world in some ways, because there's so much nothingness in my inner experience that I was like, you know, I had a friend that has a lot more, for lack of a better, this feels like it's got negative connotations, but whatever, like, chaotic inner experiences, you know, lots going on. And we were sort of chatting about it, and she was like, yeah, but when I am rehearsing a conversation or, like, super stressy about something and there's lots going on in there, that's when I know that this is, like, a really important thing, or, like, that's, you know, how I know that things matter, or whatever. And you know, whereas if I'm going into a really important meeting or something, like, more often, no, like, I think I'm just the same. I still just arrive, and it's the same presence. Anyway, so I had that thing of, like, am I the odd one, and am I missing out because mine's so quiet?
I don't think we know the answer. I'm sure I'm not in a place where I would confidently say Mel's in a better place than Kerry, or vice versa. I don't think there might be an answer to that question. I tend to doubt it, but I would say I would not characterize Kerry's experience as chaotic. Kerry had visual imagery going on a lot, but a lot of people have visual imagery going on a lot. Chaotic is when you've got 3 or 4 separate visual imageries going on at the same time, and they seem to be out of control in the sense of I don't want to be thinking about the yurt, but I can't stop thinking about the yurt. There was nothing like that in Kerry's experience that I saw.
But so in line with that, right, with discussions that I've had with friends, and again, like, this is all, I know your science brain will be going nuts at that because it's all just hearsay chat, but, you know, in a similar way to Kerry asking questions about ADHD and things, like, my brain asks questions about links with anxiety, and I wonder whether you've done any sampling about that, about whether, people that report high levels of anxiety have particularly chaotic inner experiences, etc.
I have sampled with a bunch of people who have anxiety, and I think that there's quite a lot of different ways that people can have anxiety. So it's more or less like ADHD, maybe maybe worse, maybe better. I'm not really sure about that, but there are some people whose anxiety is pretty clearly physiological, where it seems that they get overwhelmed by something going on in their body and they get distracted, and that they call that anxiety, and I think legitimately so. But there are other people for whom anxiety is a more an experiential thing, and it's experiential in ways that you just don't know until you do something like DES. And I'm not trying to sell DES, but I'm trying to say you can't believe what people tell you about their anxiety. So, for example, I have sampled with some people who are anxious, whose inner experience is populated by in conversations they feel like they have to go out and get each individual word. Like if I'm talking, you have to get this word, and then you got to get that word, and then you got to get this word. You got to make sure you understand each word one at a time. And it's an active process where you have to go out and hear it. I call that the doing of hearing. You can't just most people, when they hear the words come in and they understand them, and that's it. The doing of hearing, I think, leads to anxiety because it puts you in a sort of a feedback loop, which causes you to tremor and to trying to get I gotta get it, and so I think those are very different kinds of things. One they're probably very different neural pathways, whatever, that end up being called anxiety. And so what I think is that if we had a well-developed science of inner experience where we really knew what inner experience was going on, then we would probably divide up the world in different ways, and we wouldn't talk about anxiety that would include both of those things. We'd break it apart into however the experience manifests itself. But I don't even know that for sure, because there aren't enough people who are carefully examining inner experience. So the point that I was trying to make, which I don't think I actually made, is that the person whose inner experience had this doing of hearing phenomenon had no idea before sampling that they were engaged in that. So if you asked them how to explain their anxiety, they would said it was free-flowing anxiety, and but it seemed pretty clear to me when we were done that the anxiety came from this meddling with the experience.
Did you just find doing of hearing, or have you found other kinds of, like, doing of talking, doing of watching, doing of moving?
Well, I think most people think of themselves. Most people think of talking as being something that they drive. They're the driver of their own speech. Mm. And Kerry had a few examples where the words just rolled out, where she was the creator of the words, but she wasn't driving them at the time. She was thinking about something else or whatever, and the words just came out of her. Mm. And then there are other people, and this might be exactly your question, Julian, where they feel like they have to say each individual word. Yes, that can happen.
Do they call themselves anxious people, or do they fall under that category, you think? Or is it like too much mixing of nothing but categories?
I think the answer to that is yes.
Wait, to the first option or the second?
They think of themselves as anxious. So what I really think about that is, if you think of vibrato. You all know what vibrato is? Vibrato is the wavering of pitch that makes a singer's voice sound warm, whatever. The frequency of vibrato is pretty fixed. It's like 7 or 8 hertz. And there are a few people who are up at 9 hertz or whatever, like Joan Baez or B.B. King or something. But most people are in the 7 or 8%. And if you put your voice into a machine that can lower that can change the vibrato frequency without changing the pitch, so you can get the vibrato slows down to like 6, it no longer sounds like vibrato anymore. It's really sort of an annoying kind of a thing. So that the point that I'm trying to make here is that I think 7 or 8 hertz is the dividing line between when you can do something at 6 or 5 or 4 hertz, and when above that, then it's no longer a doing thing. This is sort of a natural, constant thing that you perceive. Like the lowest tone on a piano is like, I forget, 12 or 16 or something like that hertz. And you hear that sort of as a low A on a piano. And anything below that no longer sounds like a tone to you. It sounds like a vibration or something. It also is the case that the vibration of anxiety tremor is, I think, about 7 or 8 hertz, and I think that's not coincidental. I think it's that if you screw around with the doing of things, then what is sort of naturally the dividing line for humans between what seems like a constant thing and seems like a group of things, then that makes you anxious. That's Hurlburt's theory of anxiety. I haven't proven that, but that's what I think.
So, in a similar vein, like, again, I have a very quiet mind. I experience 0 anxiety and never have, and have been in incredibly stressful situations in my life and whatever, I can't help but then link those things, for better or worse, Russ. But so I wonder if it's possible, like, have you got any, you probably haven't sampled anyone long enough, but can you change your inner experience or train your inner experience in ways to perhaps quieten it for people that experience anxiety, or, all sorts of things, but can you train it to be more manageable, like, I don't know, to be healthier for you or something?
Well, whether you can train it, I think that's a vitally interesting question, because I think the answer to that might be yes, and I think it might be yes in fundamentally important ways. So it wouldn't surprise me if 50 years from now people will have understood that we can train at least some people who become schizophrenic. We can see it happening early enough. We can and we can intervene with it early enough and teach people how to do some stuff, and they won't become schizophrenic. So I think there's the possibility of dramatic stuff there. What those are, I don't know. I actually, my own personal private view of schizophrenia is that it has to do with the doing of things that are not in the auditory realm, but maybe in the visual realm. So when you screw around with your visual stuff, the frequency is not 6 hertz or 8 hertz or whatever. It's something else, and that gets you into difficulty. I have seen, in a few cases, dramatic changes in inner experience, sampling people, miraculous changes in inner experience. And it's not so much as the result of training, or I guess it depends on how you define training, but I think it is the result of taking a different view on your own inner experience. And the best example I've got is a study that I've written about a lot called Fran. Have I ever we talked about Fran? It's worth telling that story to a storyteller. So it's Fran was a bank teller and seriously disturbed. and she had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, borderline personality, whatever, depending on who the diagnoser was, and had multiple suicide attempts and the scars to show for it and hospitalizations. Seriously disturbed person. And she was a client of a psychologist friend of mine, and her presenting problem was that she had undesirable thoughts, and she was supposed to stop thinking about these things. She wanted to stop these thoughts. So the therapist was trying a thought-stopping technique, which with her and a bunch of other stuff. But one of the kind of thing was she was supposed to wear a rubber band around her wrist, and when she thought about something that was bad, she was supposed to snap the rubber band, and that was going to serve as, this was back in the day. This is a pretty old story, but back in the behavioral day, that was going to reduce the frequency of undesirable thoughts, which it wasn't working, and so he sent her to me, and said, you might find Hurlburt interesting. So we sampled with her, and it turned out that her samples had multiple visual imagery, and by multiple, like maybe 10 visual images going on at the same time, she said, and these images lasted a long time, and by a long time, we're talking like days for some of these things. So Kerry's imagery is quite typical of the imagery that I've seen. It's there and it's gone the next second or something. The images last on the order of seconds, I would say. Hers lasted on the order of minutes or hours or days or whatever, and they were mostly seriously unpleasant. So, for example, she saw herself sitting at the dining room table, and her father was standing over her, yelling at her and telling her that she wished she had never been born, and it was a totally visual scene. She could see through the doorway into the kitchen where her mother was standing at the sink looking back at her, and at the same time, she said, she had a visual imagery of her daughter sitting on the bed in her bedroom and telling her that she was a terrible mother. And at the same time, she had a visual image of her refrigerator with a birthday cake that she had made for her daughter. It was in the refrigerator. And at the same time, and the undesirable, the father image had been there. We saw this on several occasions. So it seemed like, she said, I have this image all the time. It seemed like she sort of had it all the time. But so this is back to Kerry's question. Well, why should you believe a report like that? This 10 images at a time, how is that possible? So at a particular sample, she had an image of a Mervyn's department store advertisement. And Mervyn's is like Dillard's or something like that. I don't know that they exist anymore. But back in the day, she had an image. One of her images was of this newspaper ad that was selling gold chains. Mervyn's was selling gold chains, and the ad had a bunch of teddy bears arranged on the page, and with chains hanging around their neck and around their arms or whatever. And so I asked her at the moment of the beep, which one of these teddy bears were you looking at? And she said, well, I was looking at all of them. And I said, well, I understand you're seeing all of them, but at the moment of the beep, which one were you particularly aimed at? And she said, I'm not aimed at any one of them. I'm aimed at all of them. And I thought, well, she's crazy. This is not possible. And, well, we know that there's figure ground phenomenon, so she doesn't know what she's talking about. So I said, well, I was conducting this interview in McDonald's, and I said, well, when you're looking at me and now you turn and look at that cup that's sitting over there on the table, do you feel yourself sort of lose me and zoom in on the cup? You sort of get to the cup and make that center? She said, no, I don't do that. When I turn my head like that, the cup becomes in the center of my visual field, but there's no sense of grasping things like figure ground phenomenon will be. So I drew her the faces, vases, ambiguous figure. You all know what that figure is. It's sometimes it's called a candlestick or whatever. People say, sometimes I see two faces looking at each other, and sometimes I see a candlestick or a vase or something in the middle. That's a well-known ambiguous figure. I drew that, and I showed it to her, and I asked her what did she saw, and she said, I see two faces and a vase. And I said, yeah, I understand that, but right now, which one do you see? And she said, well, I see both faces and vases. And I said, well, people say they alternate for her. And she said, they don't alternate for me. There's no alternation. I see them both. So I'm thinking, she doesn't know what I'm talking about, or I don't know what she's talking about, or whatever. Obviously, they've alternated. So the next time I saw her, I came armed with professionally drawn ambiguous figures, Necker cube and Boring's wife, mother-in-law, and I showed them to her, and she said they don't alternate. None of them alternate for her, she said. So you've got to wonder what the heck is going on with her. But at the end of that interview, she said, can I have these? And I said, yes. So she took them, and she called me up an hour later, and she said, well, I went back to the bank where I work, and I showed these pictures to my coworkers at the bank, and they alternate for them. And then she proceeded to give me a totally lucid description of what alternation was for her coworkers, and then said, but that doesn't happen for me. So that, for me, said, this is not a language problem. I understand what she's talking about. She understands what I'm talking about. She's talking about her inner experience, and it just doesn't happen, she said. So at the end of maybe that interview, or maybe the next one, I forget now that it's been sort of a long time ago, she said, I haven't been entirely honest with you. And I said, well, I'm interested in your inner experience as detailed as I can get it, but, it's up to you. She said, well, I have this image that I haven't told you about, and it's been there for the last several days, but I haven't told you about it. And I said, well, I'd be interested in having you tell me about it if you would like to do so. And she said, well, I will do that if you promise not to tell my therapist. And I said, sure, I will do that. And, the therapist is a friend of mine. I figured I'd deal with that. But anyway, so she said, well, I have an image of myself committing suicide. Mm. Didn't surprise me, so I figured that was what was at it. So I asked her the same kinds of questions that I would have asked Kerry about her visual imagery, which was basically, well, what do you see? And she said, well, I see the bathroom door. And I say, well, is the door open or closed? And does it open to the right or to the left? And she answered all those questions. The door was open, and it opened to the right. It opened inward into the bathroom. And then the next scene in this sequence is that she sees her medicine cabinet, and it's already open, and it's got all the medicine in it that it actually has, and it's just like a real medicine cabinet, and she sees her left hand reaching into the medicine cabinet. And it's just like a regular medicine cabinet, except it doesn't have quite so much stuff in it as a regular medicine cabinet has. And then the next scene is she knows that she has taken downers and laid down on the floor and slit her wrist, and she's now bleeding to death on the floor. Maybe she's dead already. I forget on the floor. And so I'm asking, well, from what perspective do you see yourself dead on the floor? And she says, well, it's my head is towards the door, and it's like I'm looking from the door in on myself. So I'm asking the same kind of detailed questions that we have asked of Kerry's visual imagery. I'm asking about this kind of visual imagery. She says it's just like I would be if I were dead, I think, except I'm whiter in this image than I think I would be in the real world. So we made a suicide pact. That was like 5 o'clock on Friday afternoon at McDonald's, and we made a suicide pact, and that she would call me or call her therapist or somebody or something happened, and scheduled again for Monday. So on Monday she came back, and which was good as far as I'm concerned, and she said, I've had the best weekend that I've ever had. And her samples demonstrated that. She no longer had 10 visual images going on at one time. She only had 1, maybe 2 sometimes, but a much less detailed or wild set of inner experiences. And she said, there's only one bad thing. Oh, I forgot a part of this story. I gotta back up. So I gotta back up to the part of where she was talking about showing the coworkers, the ambiguous figures. She said in that interview, when she was telling me about the coworkers, she said she and her coworkers discovered a couple of things that were important. One is she discovered why she pissed off her coworkers, And the reason for that is that one of the jobs that they did was to stand at a counter and count money, and she would engage them in conversation while they were counting, which was easy for her, and it caused them to lose count, and so they were pissed. And she found that they had only one television set in their living room. She had 3 television sets in her living room, and she watched all 3 of them at the same time. And they didn't alternate back and forth. She could watch 3 shows totally simultaneously, and she just thought everybody did that, and was surprised to find that her coworkers didn't do that. So I take those kinds of things as being the kinds of reasons that now I'm back to Kerry's original question, why should you believe it? This person was a seriously disturbed person, and she was providing me with evidence of the kinds of things that she could not possibly have made those up without being some kind of an accurate description of her inner experience, I thought. So I should have told that part of the story when I was talking about the ambiguous figures. But now we're talking about the weekend. And she says, I've had the best weekend that I've ever had, but there's one downside, and that is I can only watch one TV again, one TV now. And that was a big loss for her. She enjoyed watching 3 different TV shows at a time, but I can't do that anymore. So her experience was borne out by the fact that now at the beach she has just 1 or 2 visual imagery. And that stayed with her until she died. She died 10 years later, something like that, from a kidney failure. So her experience, I think, changed dramatically. And my explanation of that, so it could be that I just happened to be there, that it was going to change on that particular day, and I just happened to be there. Can't argue against that. I doubt it. What I think happened was that she was a seriously disturbed person because she, in her childhood, was abused in almost all manner of ways, sexually and verbally and whatever. And she learned not to look wherever it is at anything because that bad shit was going to come from that direction. And so she fragmented her inner experience apart so that she took it in, but not one thing at a time. And so everything just came at her. And then when I happened along and we happened to take a look at her suicide image, which was sort of the highest problematic image for her, and we looked at every single detail of that imagery, then she no longer was afraid of her own imagery. And so from there on out, she could look at her imagery, and she had figure ground phenomena. Oh, and the ambiguous figures now alternated for her after that. So that's the long way of answering both Kerry's and Mel's question as to why I think this is it's believable. And I think it would be hard to tell the story of Fran without saying her inner experience changed dramatically, and that there was something high fidelity about. She has a lot of visual imagery that stayed around for a long time at the outset and didn't have that afterwards. Now, whether that's training, would you say it's training? I don't know whether I would call that training or not. I think it was something that happened as the result of paying attention to her inner experience, as her inner experience actually was, that had what she would call, what I would call, a miraculous effect on her.
But so that's fascinating, because that's that story in it of itself is fascinating. So thank you. But that's in line with my biggest question with this stuff is sort of nature v nurture. Is your inner experience, you were born to interpret the world that way, and that's how you are, and that's how you will always be? Or can you do things that adjust it? And that story suggests that you can adjust it.
It seems to me that story and others more or less like it indicate that at least for some people there can be dramatic changes in their inner experience. And for in the world according to Hurlburt, it comes down to if you see your own inner experience, if you grasp your own inner experience the way your own inner experience is, then sort of dramatic things can happen for some people. Who those people are, I don't actually know. Fran's current diagnosis at the time of this was borderline personality, and the field would tell you borderline personality is sort of the hardest thing to change. If you want to have a conversation with a therapist about who are the hardest clients to deal with, borderline personality is going to come up. And is Mel characteristic of all or some or a few or just one borderline personality person? I don't know the answer to that, but I don't think anybody else does either, because you got to spend a lot of time with people, and nobody's doing it. And it's not just spend a lot of time with people. You have to set up a situation where people can tell you about their inner experience with fidelity, and people aren't doing that.
So then, and then on a smaller scale, like Kerry, you've reported this as well, that like we have found, and Julian, I feel like you've spoken about this too, maybe, of like in doing this, relatively short process on ourselves, we have, like, without overplaying it, like sort of changed as people fundamentally, thanks to the awareness of ourselves. Like, you just know yourself in a new and better way, I think. So my question is about, like, how do you, this is $1 million, quite literally probably, Russ, question of, like, how do you make it more accessible then, right? If everyone's doing it, sorry, my radiator's going off. If everyone that's doing it, or if people that are doing it are reporting positive outcomes of even just the act of doing it, how do you make it more accessible? Because clearly not everyone can have your attention for an hour a week for 10 weeks.
So I think that's a great question, and I'll answer that. Let me give a preliminary answer to that, and that is there are a few times when I have, back in the day when I was a working clinical psychologist, I have tried to use descriptive experience sampling to change somebody's behavior. So I had a guy, a client of another friend of mine, basically, who had anger management problems, and so he would bang his fist in the wall and say, "I don't feel angry. I'm just banging my fist in the wall," And we sampled with him, and it was not successful in changing his behavior. And I think my theory about that, and I don't know whether this is true or not either, but my theory about that is that there's something about the purity of the DES method that is what is transformative. And by purity, if you set out to change somebody's behavior, like therapy is about, therapy is the name of the game of therapy is to make somebody better, then I think that it's no longer a pure thing. You're trying to meddle with somebody. Whereas in the Kerry and Mel sample, our aim was to get Kerry's experience exactly as Kerry had it, and Mel's experience exactly as Mel had it. Exactly is a little strong, but with as high fidelity as we can do. What I would call pretty purely. And that, I think, turns out to be therapeutic or life-altering or whatever. But it doesn't come from the attempt to change it. It comes from the attempt at genuine apprehension, genuine understanding. Now, that's the preliminary. Now I'm going to answer your question. Could you do that at scale? And the answer to that is, I think probably you could. But it would require building a sort of a lot of people who understood that inner experience might be interesting if you could just get to it. So you could build, if the world were a kind of a place that recognized that inner experience is an important deal, then I think there might be a lot of people who could do it, who could do the Russ role, for lack of a better thing. And those people would figure out who they are, and they would have conversations. But the problem is, I don't know how many people there are. I think probably there could be a lot. I don't know how many you would need. but most people have preconceptions about the way things are. It's hard to put that aside.
Or even just beyond that, I just think people don't know in all the conversation. Like, that's how Kerry started on this. Sorry, this is going off. But like, people just have no idea that there are different versions to whatever they know. Like, any person I speak to is just like, their mind is blown at this possibility that we're all speaking different languages inside our heads. So it's just that's the problem. Like, which is why we're, doing this, and hopefully one day I'll turn it into something that changes the world. But like, it's just it's so crazy that it's this insanely different. Like, I love to describe it like that. Everyone's speaking a different language. That's how vastly different it is. We can understand that concept we know people that speak French and we can't understand that. It's exactly the same thing happening in our heads, it seems. But like, how that hasn't become a wider chat is crazy.
It's unbelievable to me.
It's crazy.
And when I wrote my first book, which is now quite a long time ago, I was worried that I had given away my professional life. I had shown that this was a good idea, and I thought everybody would take this over, and then Hurlburt would be lost in the dust as everybody else continued to do it. That has not turned out to be the case. And I don't understand why it is.
Well, that was my question. Why is it? Do people, especially in your field, reject the idea of what DES is sort of finding, or like why isn't it taking off?
I don't know the answer to that.
From a mass, from selling it to the wider public, I think part of the reason why therapy has taken off so much in recent years is because there's this obsession with improving yourself, where I think at the heart of this is literally just simply understanding yourself as is. And so I don't know, I think, I can't speak to the psych world, but I think in terms of selling it to the mass public, you have to be a very curious person to want to deep dive, and I think it benefits anyone who does it, but the people who are going to be willing to dedicate the time to do it, I think it's a smaller sample size, possibly. I don't know.
So, Julian, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I had a question for Mel, because you mentioned you tell people about this and you blow their minds. So I'm wondering how you, from a storytelling perspective, come at it. Like, how do you start people in this conversation and engage them?
That's good. Well, Kerry might be able to answer that because I blew her mind with this originally. Gosh, yeah, and you probably can remember how I told you that better than I can, Kerry. So I'd be curious, can you remember how I brought it up with you first? And then
I saw you'd posted a story of wearing the beeper, and I was like, I think I asked you, what are you doing? And because it looks like a Walkman, and we were out, I think at brunch or something, at coffee, and I had my other friend there, and I just remember, I think you opened with my inner experiences, that I basically have vibes, is how you described it, and I was like, hang on, what? What are you talking about? That can't be possible. I'm talking to you, and I have other thoughts rolling in the back of my head, and I've got a visual over here, and how do you just have vibes? So that was, I think that to me would be the draw from a storytelling perspective. Because once you establish that that's possible, then people are like, hang on, wait, but I experienced this, and then wait, how do you experience this, and vice versa. Because the friend I was with, she had a very strong inner monologue. I obviously have a mix of visual and audio, and then Mel is just complete vibes. So it's just, I think starting with your experience, Mel, I think would be the hook, because that made me be like, how is that even physically possible? And I obviously wanted to know more, which is why I'm here.
Yeah, I think that's how I ended up, with you, Julian, Russ, in the first place. I remember reading an article that, you know, Russ was quoted in, or his work was quoted in, and, you know, something like that. And I distinctly remember this, which is crazy because I have a terrible memory, which is probably related to my inner experience, but we digress. And I will never forget, it was in COVID, and I was reading this, and it was about, like, yeah, guess what? Not everyone has an inner monologue, and a lot of people are, like, quite visual and stuff. And I was like, what? What do you mean? An inner, like, I'm neither of those things really. And then so I remember, you know, we're in lockdown. I was talking about it with my family, and my dad, I think now, sort of believes me after all these years of doing stuff on it. But he was like, "You're a liar. Like, you're trying to craft this, like, oh, I'm a creative. I don't have an inner monologue," because he just couldn't. He could not fathom what I was saying. So that's when it was like, no, I can't fathom what you're saying. So I think my curiosity with the whole thing stemmed from the fact that my experience seems to be so vastly different and extreme on one side of things to a lot of the general public that perhaps falls into this bit. And then the more this has gone on, so that's how the chat starts, I think, Julian, with people of my own experience being so intuitive based and certainly no signs of inner monologue. That fascinates people. And then so, like, the longer this has gone on and the more I reflect about the way to tell this story in a documentary format and stuff like that, I have come to realize that it's got to be autobiographical, I think, and that was not my intention leading into this, but I think certainly that's what makes the most sense, that it's sort of me learning about myself in order to then open up this whole chat. And that's where, yeah, again, I think a lovely way to sort of sum all of that up is how we're all speaking different languages within, you know, our inner experience is just a different language. I think that paints a picture very quickly for people. It's like tangible.
Also, just from a storytelling perspective, I don't know if this like fits in at all, but I remember right after having that conversation with you, Mel, in New York, and I was mind blown. It actually made me reflect on my previous relationship that I was in, because I used to always ask my ex-partner, I used to say, "What are you thinking right now?" He'd be looking off in the distance, and I'd do, "What are you thinking? What are you thinking?" And he'd always say nothing. And in my head, I was like, he's lying to me. That's not possible. And then hearing Mel say that sometimes, or most of the time, she's not thinking anything, I was like, it just completely opened up. I didn't think it was physically possible to do. And I'd been telling that story to myself because I'd only been inside my own head. I can't be inside my partner's head. And so her saying that completely made me reevaluate how I interact and speak with people, friends, family, partners, etc. Because I just didn't think that was even possible. So
the chances are good he was lying to you. because there aren't too many people who really have nothing going on.
Yeah.
And it also demonstrates why the beep is important, because your question, well, what are you thinking about right now? That question takes a second to articulate. And by the time you get to the end of that question, you can wipe out, your partner probably could wipe out what was going on in his inner experience. And so by the end of that question, then the answer is nothing. Mm. But it's also quite possible that he doesn't want to tell you what he was actually going on with him. I don't know him or you or whatever. I'm not trying to cast any aspersions here. But I do want to double back and speculate a little bit about Mel's question about why hasn't it caught on or something like that. And I think I speculate about this. I don't know whether this is true or not, but my speculation is we live in an age that is materialistic as opposed to genuinely interested in something that might be true or something like that. So it's how much money does it make for you, how much power does it accrue to you, rather than how much you are genuinely aligned with the actual world or whatever. And I think that the world is not always that way. I think I think it is that way for our generation, my generation, your generation, all of the last number of years. We have leaned heavily in that direction. But I think there have been cultures where inner experience has been totally accepted, and meditation, true, genuine meditation, is the centerpiece of everybody's existence. It's not in ours. So that's one where it's uphill against the materialistic view that has us by the short hairs, I guess you could say. Mm. And then the other thing I would say is that I give talks about this kind of stuff around the world, and to psychologists and other people, and almost everybody is totally interested, it seems. I tell some of the same kinds of stories. I'd tell a story about Kerry or Mel or somebody, and people would find that genuinely interesting. But those psychologists hardly ever do anything about it. They indicate that that this would be really important to me, but then they don't do it. And I don't know the answer to why they don't do it, but I suspect it's because they're driven by the materialistic portions, and it's just so much easier to give a questionnaire to somebody, and then you can publish it, and then you can get tenure and promotion and raises and whatever. And it takes too long to do the kind of stuff that we're doing here. But the result of that is then you don't find out anything genuine.
Mm. But I think it is $1 million question at the moment. I think if you want to go down that route, I think there's plenty of money to be made if you could solve how to make this available to the masses. I think, as Kerry rightfully pointed out, therapy is more common than ever, I presume. It feels that way. And there's and people are becoming more lost than ever, in sort of line with what you were saying, Russ, in terms of, I think we're in this era culturally that there's less, study of the self happening, and people are more lost than ever. So I think with successful storytelling and creative thinking about how you could make these sorts, a tool like DES genuinely accessible to masses, I think that you could find a way to make that commercially attractive as well as for the greater good of society. Because I think the more you know yourself, the better you are at all these things. You show up better relationships-wise. You can be better at whatever finance job you do or whatever. I think if you sell the story right, it can be attractive.
So I agree with that, and sometimes when I reflect on my career and what I did wrong in my career, it was that I didn't do that. I have been through my career sort of reluctant to do that, because I have thought that the genuineness was more important than the economic benefit of it. And I'm a university professor. I'm adequately paid for what it is that I do. It seems to me that my task in life or whatever is to try to get to the genuine truth about whatever, and let the state of Nevada pay me to do that. And there are times when I think that was a mistake, because I think it's possible that had I made this genuineness more economically viable, that then I could have had more influence and maybe turned the pressure up, turn the direction up, turn the tap on towards more inner experience. I think that's quite possibly true. I don't know whether it's true for sure, because I think it's also possible that it would have demonstrably cheapened it. So I can sleep easily thinking that Kerry has a lot of visual imagery and Mel doesn't. And I'm pretty sure that has not been fucked up by my trying to get more money out of Mel or out of Kerry or out of the process. But whether that was the right thing to do or a good thing to do or not, I don't actually know.
It's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
trying to think if I have any other questions. I mean, I have a million, obviously, but...
My only other question was, and I obviously didn't sit in on Mel's sampling, but was there anything that either Mel or I described or said that surprised you in any way? I feel like no, because you've done so many samples, but I just wanted to ask.
Well, I think we had to work pretty hard with Mel to make sure we understood about her lack of otherwise inner experience. That was hard, fairly hard work.
Is Mel on, not to say that it's a spectrum, but on the far end of the spectrum of unsymbolized thinking? Like, is she like really far on that end where it's just not much happening? Sorry if I'm wording that offensively.
So in my world, unsymbolized thinking is not nothing happening. Unsymbolized thinking is a directly apprehended thought.
Yeah.
Every bit as so if you had said to yourself, I wonder where this cabin is on Mount Eldora, said that in inner speech, or you could have thought, I wonder where this cabin is, but no words or whatever, but every bit as directly present to you, I'm wondering where the cabin on Eldora is. That's what unsymbolized thinking is. That was not Mel. Mel did not have that kind of thought process. Mel had more nothing than an articulated thought, even though that thought was not articulated in words. Which is the hard part, because Mel's been talking about it like, well, it's in different language, but it's way more three-dimensional than just different language. It's the hard part.
And so I would, and then like, obviously you reflect on your own behavior and whatever. And so a link that I made was like, I've always, I don't actively meditate, but if I went to a yoga class or like, and they make you meditate, like, I'm brilliant at it. And that used to really annoy my housemate, who has like, maybe something close to borderline personality disorder. Like, she had a lot of shit. And so we would go together and the teacher would be like, tell us I was like, yeah, I smashed it. I just, 2 seconds in, yeah, there's nothing going on. And she's like, how can you do that? And it's because it's like my always. And so I say that to people of like, when trying to explain my nothingness, it's like a meditative state pretty much all the time. It's nothingness, as Russ is saying, it's not. Yeah. For better or worse, I think too. I think people have this habit, in me talking to people have a habit of romanticizing it, and I'm always cautious of that, because as I said earlier, I reflect on whether I'm missing out on certain things as well. I think it's really easy to be like, wow, a quiet mind, that sounds so nice, must be nice. But I'm not sure it's that simple.
And I'm not sure it is, which is why I have tried in our conversation here today to be pretty neutral about whether your inner experience is better or worse or whatever than Kerry's, because I really don't know the answer to that. I do think it is the case that people who meditate a lot have relatively quiet minds much of the time. I mean, it is a skill that one can master in the meditation world.
Yeah.
Whether that's the same kind of thing that Mel's got, I'm not sure about that. It might very well be. I'm not saying it isn't. I'm just saying we need a lot more work to be able to answer those kinds of questions authoritatively.
As a sidebar, Mel, how does memory work for you? Like, if you're thinking,
it doesn't.
You don't have a single childhood memory.
No, I have a terrible memory, and no, absolutely not. Yeah, and then that freaks me out, and I think that it's directly related. I do. I don't know what Russ hates when I do these things, but like, I have no. Yeah, again, people will be like, tell us your earliest, happiest memory, or like, a memory from your childhood. I can't tell you one. I have a terrible memory, whether it's yesterday or whether it's my childhood. I know facts of my life. I know I studied at RMIT University. I know I grew up in Ballarat in a house that's this color and it was on this street. I know the facts of my life, but I think I'm very susceptible to ending up in some cult because I could easily be convinced of a different reality of my upbringing or my life because I know it to be true, but I can't feel it, I can't remember it, I can't see it, or it's as if I read a book and I forget it straight away, like I can't, but so that's where, but everything is intuitive for me, so like I definitely think everything that I've experienced in my life is relevant to how I show up in the world, or very subconsciously that's how why I make certain choices or whatever. Like everything has shaped me for sure, but I can't remember any aspects of my life.
So I'm guessing that's probably half true, and which half I'm not exactly sure. But I'm guessing. So where was the house that you grew up in? Where was it located, and how old were you when you grew up there?
Like I can't answer that, Russ. I could not tell you how old I was when I moved into the house that my parents are currently in.
Approximately.
14.
Okay. And was it a one-story house or a two-story house?
Well, it's a one-story house.
And have a driveway?
Yes.
And did the driveway come down the right-hand side of the house or the left-hand side of the house as you're looking at it from the street?
Okay, so if I tell you, so right now that house I'm thinking of, this is interesting, is the house my parents currently live in, and I could answer all those questions. If I think the house before that, I can't answer your questions about what side the driveway was on and stuff.
So I'm not sure I can do that either. So I could make it up, but I'm not 100% sure that I could do it. I'm guessing Kerry would put a visual image out there.
Yeah.
And then it would be interesting to know whether we could alter Kerry's visual imagery. There's lots of work that says that memory is not retrieving an image that has been stored away since Kerry was 4 years old or whatever. Memory is stuff that's made up at the time. Yet when I asked you to remember your house, it wasn't like you were going back in some file drawer to figure out a picture of that and pull it out. But all that is to say, I don't think we know too much about memory either. We know quite a bit about memory, but we don't know much about the inner experience of memory.
Have you seen there's a Netflix special narrated by Emma Stone, and they focus on different things, but they have one episode on memory. Have you seen that, Russ?
No.
I feel like you would really like it. They tell this story of a girl who was quite young when 9/11 happened, and she was living in New Jersey, and she has this like distinct memory of looking out the window and seeing the Twin Towers collapse. But they went back to her apartment that she was staying in when she was that age, and there's no window facing across the water to the Twin Towers. What they anticipate, or what they interpreted, was that she would have been watching the TV, but she remembered the TV as a window in her mind, which is really interesting. But obviously it was a horrible day, and it's like a memory that's burned into her brain, and she sees a window in her brain, right. But it's not possible.
But it's not a memory, and it's probably not. It's probably not constant. So it seems like it's burned into her brain, but what happens is that when she recalls it, it feels like it's burned into her brain.
Yeah.
10 years from now, she'll recall something that's different, and she will say, "That's burned into my brain."
Mm-hmm.
That's. I think that is the way memory is. Memory seems like it is something which is retrieved from 9/11, but it's not. It's made up in 2024 as if it were retrieved from 9/11.
Yeah.
And so to that point there, like when you say burned into your brain, right? The reason then I struggle with memory is because of the way that my inner experience is in terms of this nothingness, and there's no audio-visual stuff to grab at or whatever. I think that's directly related.
Could be. So back to your other question about why isn't DES more available. You, Mel, you have, or we all have, or at least Julian and Mel and I have, we have sort of a case study because Julian came into this study thinking that he knew about DES. And now I think he would tell you that he wasn't so sure about it. He was pretty sure at the beginning, I think. So it takes there is a total case study to be made about how what it takes to figure out what DES is actually about, and that there's a lot of stuff there. It's what Julian thought that was mistaken about what I had written, and what I had written that was actually mistaken, and what I hadn't written, and what I had ambiguously. I'm not blaming anybody here. I'm just saying that the challenge of doing DES is, well, at least for some people, takes some undoing before you can then learn how to do it. And probably for everybody, including for me.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering if my struggles are common struggles or if each person has their own struggles when they try to do DES. Because I think for Mel, we called it meta things. Like I was asking about the content of Mel's experience. Like Mel would say, I was watching a movie, and I would try to ask, like, well, what about the movie? Like, what was happening? And Mel would say, I didn't write it down. It's not so important. And then I would think, oh, well, the content wasn't part of it. And then Russ would say, no, content was part of it. Mel was absorbed in the movie or absorbed in the conversation, but you just weren't like singling out any one thing. Like so that was my struggle there. And for Kerry, my struggle was I would talk about like mental images. Like I would talk about you looking at or seeing a mental image. And Russ would say, it's not an image. Kerry is seeing a dog. She's not seeing an image of a dog. There's no like separation between you and like this image of what you're seeing. So yeah, I was wondering if those are common problems or if everybody has like different problems.
So they're very common problems. Everybody has their own take on them. You, in my experience, were more difficult than some people, I think, and at least in part because you had read more about my stuff before you met me, whereas most people that I meet are pretty ignorant about what I have written, and so they haven't developed a take that's actually sort of at an angle from what I really was trying to say when I said whatever it is that I said. But nobody finds it easy, and I don't know whether this is my problem either, Mel. So this is part of the deal. If in answer to your question, so if I had, let's say in 2001, let's say in 2001, I had created an institute, and got people to pay to come to talk to me, and then I hired a bunch of therapists or whatever, a bunch of people who would take the interviewer role. Could I have trained people to do what I do well or better than I do it? I don't know the answer to that. I would say, in the way that I have done it, I think most people think that they're not as good at it as they would like to be, and even after they've spent quite a bit of time with me. And I don't know whether that's my failure or whether I haven't done a good job of training or haven't figured out how to train or whatever. I don't know.
I think it's just an impossible task. It's so difficult. It also feels like something that can just never be mastered. You know, like Russ, you've dedicated so many years to this, so it's just greater practice, and you know, the more you do it from either side of the fence, the more you learn what sorts of questions to ask or what to be looking out for or different possibilities. You know, I think it's the exposure to so many different versions of inner experiences helps
I think that's true. If I have a personality characteristic that led me to do whatever it is, I would say it's that I'm not satisfied with things. I'm never, hardly ever satisfied. But whether that is what led me to discover DES, or whether that's the result of having done DES for a long time, I don't really know.
Drew, what did lead you on this? How did your mind first go, hang on a second, everyone's got something different going on in their head?
I built a beeper back in 1973, so 50 years and 5 months ago, I built a beeper. And at the time, I gave it questionnaires very similar to what EMA and ESM nowadays are doing. I gave it, at that time, a pad of paper with Likert scales on them, and a beeper. And then people would fill out these forms and bring them back to me, and I would enter them in the computer and do all kinds of fancy analyses on them. And all the while, for me, I could not get past the fact that I didn't know what the hell a guy meant when he answered a 5 on a Likert scale about how much is this about the past, or how much sexuality is involved with this, and they're putting Likert scales on there. And I came to believe that that if you didn't understand the basic data that was going into your calculation, then you could never understand what was coming out, garbage in, garbage out. And so I thought at the time, well, I got the beeper seems like a good idea, and but Likert scales weren't, questionnaires weren't, so I started asking people, well, what did you mean when you answered 4 on the sexuality scale? And they gave me some kind of a story which I could tell was being made up. And they knew it was being made up. They didn't really know. I didn't know. Nobody knew. They didn't know why they gave a 4. I didn't know why they gave a 4. No amount of fancy factor analysis that I would provide to this stuff would answer that question. And so I abandoned the work that I had been doing, and I scoured the world basically for what do you do about inner experience. So I read the introspection literature and the phenomenology literature and the Buddhism literature and the Jainism literature, and the beeper still seemed like a good idea to me. I mean, the Zen people have been doing that for 1,000 or 5,000 years or whatever, but not as good as I think the beeper. They use a gong, and the gong vibrates over the hillside, and you're supposed to pay attention to what's going on with you when the gong sounds, but the gong has a slow rise time and echoes all over the place, and so it seemed like the beeper was better than that, and so I started trying to ask the questions carefully. And I think they are the most interesting questions in the world. And most everybody agrees with that, Penny for your thoughts. Kerry's asking her boyfriend for Penny for your thoughts because she thinks that's interesting. And everybody does, I think. I just try to do it better.
And I think having a greater awareness of your inner experience, but then B, other versions of inner experience definitely, increase empathy and impact how we impact our relationships and how we deal with people. And I think that's aside from everything else, and aside from the personal satisfaction and all the positives that can come from you personally, I think like the greater good thing of like, hey, we can all interact with each other a little better when we do this. I think that is why it's $1 million storytelling issue now, because we could all, it just makes you interact with people better, I think.
It's totally interesting for me because it's a 3-dimensional crossword puzzle challenge every time. So working with Mel, it's a matter of how can we how can we figure out how to talk about Mel's experience when she's got relatively little stuff to talk about? We've got to figure out how we can put that into words and that rest lightly on Mel's experience from Mel's point of view, and yet you use the language in a way that the external world generally uses it, which Mel hasn't had to do with her own experience. And that, for me, is as organismically involved process as you can get, because you got it, or almost as you can get, because Mel doesn't know what she's talking about, and I don't know what she's talking about, and we've got to figure out what she's talking about. And then Kerry, it's an entirely different deal. Kerry's processes are somewhat different. We got to figure out, she doesn't know how to describe it, and we got to help her to do it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's totally interesting, and the challenge is not to put some characteristic of Russ's interest in between me and Mel, or between me and Kerry. And that's, that I think is sort of the heart of the urge to get to the truth or something. Is don't try to validate your own theories, because your own theories are wrong. Sooner or later, you're going to figure out that they're wrong. And I think that the modern era doesn't understand that. The modern era modern psychology, I think, thinks that validating theories is the ultimate path, and I think it's not.
I think Mel needs to make a documentary, and then you guys need to go on Diary of a CEO podcast and Jay Shetty podcast, and then I think this will become a mass thing.
Have they ever asked you on, actually, Russ? Have you been asked? Like, I'm surprised you've never done like a Jay Shetty. Do you know what that podcast is?
I don't know that.
God, I'm about to be your PR advisor.
I know. I'm like, in my head, I'm like, branding, marketing, let's go.
But that's sort of the idea of how we all got here. I think there's a big storytelling piece that needs to happen to open up the floodgates to a wider audience, and then there's the floodgates are open, but certainly there's a storytelling piece that makes it a little more accessible and understandable to like the whole world. That's the challenge, and it's a fucking hard challenge, but that's the exciting challenge.
Yeah, I've been on a number of podcasts, but they're all sort of esoteric, I guess.
I think, without speaking for you, I think that they're not. You haven't been on the pop culture podcast circuit. That's the difference here. Mm. So the podcasts that Kerry just mentioned are podcasts that would be in the top 20 podcasts in the world, pop culturally. And I think that's, without speaking for you, Russ, I don't know enough about like what interviews you've done and whatever to like fully know. I mean, obviously I read your stuff, in the New York Times and things like that. So there's some aspect of it, but I would argue that your stuff it still lives heavily in the psychology or academic world, where we want to do something that brings it out into the pop culture, broader cultural world. I think that's the interesting challenge, to try and get the story out into that wider audience that's not necessarily just the audience of really interested academic psychology people.
I think a really important part of the storytelling is actually focusing on the individual stories, like you telling us that Fran example, for instance. Because I feel like Mel and I were like, okay, I have ADHD because I have a super active visual auditory brain, and Mel doesn't have ADHD because she doesn't have anything going on, which obviously is like a blanket statement, but that's, I think, where people want to go. They're like, oh, tell me about myself, make these grand assumptions based off of this information that you have. But I think to avoid that, focusing on the stories that you've come across in your research where you can pinpoint this is what happened for this person, and then people can either relate to that or contrast their experience to that, I think is the way to do it, because we're gonna want to tell all these stories based off of like kind of grander assumptions, but I think the way you bridge the gap between academia and pop culture storytelling is actually just focusing on the individual stories where people can maybe make their own conclusions from, but you would feel confident in that as a researcher because you're not making these big claims, but there's also a story to be told. Like that friend story is incredible. And so I think that's how you ultimately bridge the gap. And whether you do that starting with Mel's specific, experience and then going from there, I think is, I don't know, I'll leave that to Mel, but I just think that that's a good way of not making giant claims, but also not making it so academic that the grand masses don't want to pay attention to it.
I suspect you're right.
I think DES is wasted on academia. I always get more interest from just, regular friends or people at parties, and when I talk to academics, I mean, they can be interested, but it's often like, how can I use it to study this theory that I already have? And like, DES doesn't work that way. And I think that's part of why I had trouble coming into it, was I, too long in academia, surrounded by all these theories and metacognition and all this stuff, and then to break away from that and go for that's why I want to try to make YouTube videos of this stuff and see how that goes. And Mel, you were talking about like editing or making your own podcast. I think there are so many possibilities.
It'd also be really interesting, now I'm just thinking of literal advertising campaigns, but it'd also be really interesting to pick people within pop culture and do DES with them and then have them talk about okay, this is my inner experience. Generally speaking, I have a lot of visuals, or I have this, or whatever, and then people will be like, what? What?
Call it better.
So I have thought for a long time that is by far the best way to do it. And so I have made, over the course of my career, quite a few offers, not as many as I probably should have, to more or less famous people. And I've thought that it was a sixth degree of separation kind of a deal. Is maybe this is like a step here. And now you all might know somebody. You're gonna Mel's gonna be talking to Djokovic or whatever next month, and she could tell this story. And if he's interested, then we can sample with him, and that would be an interesting thing to do, or whatever. But not necessarily him. I'm not trying to plant that seed, but you all might have somebody in mind that. Wouldn't it be interesting to know what Beyonce's inner experience was, and you might have a conversation with Beyonce in which you could say, it might be interesting. You might be interested in this. Sooner or later, that'll happen, and that will be interesting.
We also have grand plans for how to market this.
Yeah, I know. I don't doubt that it will take off, and it's very easy to market it. It's just the challenge. It is like, you know this, Russ and Julian, from doing it as well. Like, it's one thing to try and do DES to understand to this is like sort of one of the. It's so attractive to me because it's it's the hardest story I've ever come across to attempt to tell, for sure. And that's why it's so interesting and so fascinating, because you don't get stories like this that are so fascinating yet so untapped and has so much potential, but it is so challenging to tell this simply because it's not a simple thing. And so that is why the last 2 years have been so important in just understanding DES, understanding variations, understanding all of this, to then, as a storyteller, try and work out how it's the best way to tell it. And I think, we're certainly getting really close to that now, where I'm at the point where I am working with people that are far better storytellers than that I can, broach this wonderful idea with and get assistance on, okay, how can we like genuinely make this abstract idea into a tangible documentary, tell this story. I think we're very much at that point now.
So when you talk to those people, you could say Hurlburt would probably be willing to sample with you as well. Have a sample of Mel and Russ and that guy, or Mel and Julian and Russ and that guy, or Mel and Kerry and Russ and that guy, or somebody, or whomever. We could figure that out. Maybe. I think my experience is that there are very few people who don't find it interesting.
Mm. Yeah, exactly. So it's just about how do you tell it?
How do you get to them? How do you reveal to them that it's interesting?
Correct.
Because everybody thinks they know what it would be, and they don't. And you can't tell them.
So it's how.
But you're in a position. Mel's in a position where she can tell them, and so is Kerry, and so is Julian. Actually, and you're in some ways a better position than I am.
Yeah, I think we are. The exciting challenge is how can we tell this in a way that allows it to be on the front page of Netflix so that everyone can watch it and realize this is the most fascinating topic in the world. I don't think that's like a unrealistic, lofty dream. I think that's a genuine, that's not a dream, that's a goal, that's an achievable goal, because the subject matter is so unique and interesting and untapped. So, it's two parts of like, we had to wait for me to understand it enough, and also my career to continue to progress. And lo and behold, I'm currently doing a documentary for Amazon and about to do another, and these relationships are helpful. So, yeah, I think that's our challenge, and it's an exciting one, and I don't think it's an impossible one at all. Yeah.
I'm excited.
Yeah.
Well, it'll be interesting.
It's just not a fast process. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, but I want to ask one final question, and then I'll shut up. It's probably in line with what we just spoke about then, but like, Russ, what are your remaining curiosities with DES, or like goals or dreams, or what still interests you with it all?
So I'm probably more like you than you give me credit for, because I don't really have goals or dreams or whatever. Never have. I have tried to. I have tried to get people into the position where they can reveal themselves to me in ways that I find believable, and I'm still interested in. I don't really. I think there's some value in that. I don't know whether the value extends beyond me, really. Maybe it does. It probably does. I think it does. But I don't really have. I don't know. I don't know that. I think it's. But I don't have a grand plan. And so you say, for example, we're going to put this on the front page of Netflix. Well, I think that'd be interesting. It doesn't. It frightens me as much as it interests me. Frightens isn't exactly the right word, but it will. I don't know what that would be like.
Russ, do you think, like when you phrase things, you don't make grand statements and you're very careful? Like you say, I don't know if it's helpful. I think it's helpful, but I don't know. I can't prove that it's helpful. And I feel like often to popularize something in mass media, usually people are like, this will change everything, and those are kind of opposite things. So I'm thinking of myself, like I want to do DS and I also want to try to convey it. Like, do you think there's something to fight there, like with conveying it versus doing it?
I don't know the answer to that question. So I have said all along in all of our interviews, I think, that I don't know how much of it is peculiarly Russian kind of, and I think what you just said, Julian, is sort of right on the money about the way I am, because I think I am, I guess, down to my core, pretty much. I don't know the answer to that, and so when somebody asks me a question and I say I don't know, it's not like that's a gloss or whatever. That's I'm trying to answer the question as genuinely as I can. Mm-hmm. And that I take to be sort of the heart of the matter, is trying to answer the questions, is trying to do whatever it is as genuinely as you can, which is totally short of perfection. I'm well aware of my own sins and whatever, but the effort to try to do as good a job as you can do. That's sort of the heart of it. And in my case, it's get at somebody else's experience, and then you put those two together, and you got DES. I'm not sure that answered your question.
But exactly, Julian, I would say this is where Russ is too close to it and respects DES too much to be able to sell it in the way that is required. Like it's a beautiful, noble thing, but as in you need a third party to convince the world that this is a good thing because you are too noble to make the grand statements required, I think.
So that when I say I'm afraid of what would happen when it's on Netflix, that's exactly the problem. So what's on Netflix is going to be sold in a way, and the question is whether I would find that repugnant, I guess.
And that's where you have to trust your storytelling partner to not make it repugnant.
I absolutely agree with that.
Like really though. Because if it's not told with the nuance and care that you give it, that's when you would react that way. And that's the challenge, that it needs the nuance and the intricacy that you afford it, and is what makes it so special.
But Netflix or whatever has virtues. As the story can be sort of a long story, and maybe it has to be a long story, which is sort of the story that what I have spent the last 4 or 5 years of my career doing is putting these things out onto the web, which Kerry, you and I, we have to have a joint discussion about whether we can do that with yours. But that is the nuance. People can, the nuance is there. People who want it can find the nuance, which I have been trying as best I can to describe at every step of the way. So it's not just that I have put those videos out there of me doing the interviews, but I have put a commentary on that, and that commentary is designed to provide the nuance. And for better or for worse. And that's, I guess, that's the end of that story. But except Kerry, is it all right with you, or you want to think about it, whether it's all right with you to have your interviews be put on the web in more or less the same way as Mel's has been?
Yeah, I don't mind at all. So okay. Go for it.
Well, sooner or later I will apply myself to doing that.
Gotta do the same.
Also,
and then we also thought about having a green meeting, and I think we decided last time we should have a green meeting.
Yeah.
Can we do a double green meeting comparing Mel and I? Is that not allowed?
The green meetings generally take 3 or 4 hours.
Okay.
What? How? How? I'm serious.
And the green meetings generally last over several days.
Okay.
I'm serious. How? What do you talk about for that long? This is the storytelling problem we have.
So we should do one and see, maybe we can do it fast. And it's possible that Kerry's green meetings would be fairly quick. I think. Well, maybe not. So the what takes a long time is because in the world according to Hurlburt, everything is try to get it genuinely right. So I want Kerry to understand what I understand, and I want Julian to understand what I understand, and I want to understand what Julian understands, and whatever. And that takes time. So it's not just about. Sorry.
Do you go through like every beep?
Every beep.
Wow.
And we say somebody says this is what I understood about this beep, and then, well, I think we probably ought to just do it, and you get a chance to see. But we try to characterize the beep in a few pithy words, 6 or 8 words maybe. Characterize this beep. But then we have to make sure that those words fit happily on everybody's tongue, and that just takes time.
Wow, why did we never do this with me? I didn't even know this existed. We got distracted by Kerry.
So the Mel interviews, from my point of view, are as much Julian interviews as they are Mel interviews. There's
Nothing outside Mel.
There's much the transformation of Julian as Mel coming to find out about her inner experience. And I'm guessing that confused me when it came time to do a green meeting. So I was thinking more about Julian than I was about Mel, or at least as much about Julian.
Unbelievable, Julian.
Yeah, mucking around.
All of that to say a green meeting. I mean, if it's too late to do me, that doesn't matter, but at the very least, I'd like to sit in on a Kerry green, like I need to experience one of these for sure.
So as a general rule, the green meeting, I always think I want to do the most recent thing first. So if we're going to do 2 green meetings, I would rather do Kerry first and then Mel, rather than the other way around, because the fidelity is always in the near term. So I'm always in favor of doing the most frequent. So we set a time aside on this January 3rd on Friday at 4 o'clock or whatever. Do we want to do at least start a green meeting for Kerry on that day?